She was only 4 years old, a little girl with bright eyes, tiny hands, and a smile that could soften the hardest heart. Her name was Kaylen Michelle Young. At an age where life should have been filled with crayons, cartoons, and the safety of her home, she instead faced a fate no child should ever endure. On one tragic day, Kaylen's life was brutally stolen in an act of violence so horrific, investigators would later find her face imprinted into the carpet, a haunting reminder of her final moments. Kaylen wasn't a statistic. She wasn't just another case. She was a child, playful and curious, known for her laughter and innocence. Family members recall her singing little songs, scribbling drawings only a 4-year-old could imagine, and running with carefree joy. She should have been protected. She should have been safe. But behind closed doors, her world was far darker than it appeared. Living in a blended family, Kaylen had been placed in the care of her stepmother, someone expected to nurture her, to guide her, to love her. Instead, resentment and rage began to fester. And on that fateful day, those emotions erupted into violence that silenced a little girl forever. For investigators, the scene told its own story. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a single mistake. The injuries on Kaylen's small body revealed a truth too painful to comprehend. She had been subjected to unimaginable suffering. What happened to Kaylen Michelle Young is more than just a crime. It is a reflection of the hidden dangers children face, the failures of protection, and the devastating consequences when trust is betrayed. Her story is one of innocence lost, of silence that speaks louder than words, and of justice that must answer for the life of a little girl who should still be here today. Behind every crime, there is a history, fragments of daily life that, when pieced together, reveal how violence takes root. For Kaylen Michelle Young, that history was found inside her own home. Kaylen lived in what many saw as an ordinary blended family. Her father had remarried, and his new wife had stepped into the role of stepmother. To neighbors and outsiders, it may have seemed like a chance for stability, a chance for Kaylen to grow up surrounded by love and security. But behind the walls of that house, tensions began to simmer. The stepmother's role, instead of becoming one of care and protection, grew darker with time. What should have been patience became resentment. What should have been compassion hardened into frustration. The young girl who needed nurturing instead found herself facing the sharp edge of hostility from the very person tasked with raising her. Family members would later recall warning signs, subtle hints that Kaylen was not living in the safe environment she deserved. Bruises explained away, excuses offered too quickly, and moments of unease that never fully added up. But as with so many stories of child abuse, the truth remained hidden in plain sight until it was far too late. Kaylen was too young to put her fear into words, too young to explain that the person meant to care for her had become a source of terror. And so, the silence continued until it ended in tragedy. March 14, 2008, began like any other day inside the Young household. But by evening, the ordinary would turn into something horrific. Police records show that sometime during the afternoon, the stepmother's simmering anger exploded into violence. What should have been a moment of play and childhood innocence for Kaylen turned into her final hours of life. The attack was merciless. Authorities later described the scene in haunting detail. Kaylen had been beaten with such force that her small face left a clear imprint in the carpet. Investigators would note that this chilling image, her last moment of suffering, was one of the most disturbing signs of the brutality she endured. When paramedics arrived, Kaylen was already gone. The tiny, fragile body of a 4-year-old child had been pushed beyond its limits by blunt force trauma. The violence was not accidental. It was targeted. And it was final. For police officers, even seasoned detectives, the scene was almost too much to bear. One officer later admitted that the case stayed with him long after the investigation ended, because it was not just a crime, it was a destruction of innocence itself. In that single day, the promise of a child's future was extinguished, and what remained was a question every investigator asked. How could anyone do this to a child? From the moment authorities walked into that home, it was clear this was not a tragic accident. It was a crime scene. The stepmother's story began to unravel almost immediately. She claimed Kaylen had simply fallen, but the evidence told a different story. Investigators noted the severity of the injuries, the clear imprint of her tiny face in the carpet, and the autopsy later confirmed what police already suspected. Kaylen had died from blunt force trauma. This was not a fall. It was an assault. Neighbors reported hearing unsettling noises, raised voices, crying, thuds against the floor. One neighbor would later testify that the sounds made her pause, uneasy but unsure what was happening behind the closed doors. Detectives began questioning everyone in the household. Very quickly, the focus turned to the stepmother. Her inconsistent statements, her visible agitation, and the sheer weight of forensic evidence all pointed to her. When the autopsy report was finalized, it left no room for doubt. The medical examiner concluded that Kaylen's injuries were consistent with repeated, violent strikes. Her small frame had absorbed blows far beyond what any child could withstand. Confronted with the mounting evidence, the stepmother was arrested. For many in the community, the news brought a complicated mix of relief and outrage. Relief that someone was finally being held accountable, but outrage at the unimaginable cruelty of the crime. The charge was clear: murder. But for Kaylen's family, no courtroom, no sentence could undo the reality that their little girl was gone. When the trial began, the courtroom carried a heavy silence. Every detail, every photograph, every expert testimony painted a picture of unthinkable cruelty, and at the center of it all was a 4-year-old girl whose life had barely begun. The prosecution laid out its case with precision. They called medical examiners to the stand, who testified to the blunt force trauma that ended Kaylen's life. One doctor described the injuries as asterisk, the kind seen in high-impact collisions, not everyday accidents. Asterisk, the jury saw photos that no one should ever have to see, images that made clear this was not an accident, but an act of violence. Prosecutors argued that the stepmother acted with deliberate malice, a deep-rooted anger that erupted in brutality. They highlighted her shifting statements to investigators, her failure to call for help in time, and the horrifying fact that Kaylen's face had been driven so forcefully into the carpet it left an imprint. The defense, in contrast, scrambled to create doubt. They suggested stress, exhaustion, or even a moment of uncontrolled discipline gone too far. But as each witness spoke, and as the physical evidence was presented, that defense seemed increasingly hollow. Family members sat through every testimony, their grief visible, their pain undeniable. Some broke down in tears as prosecutors replayed the final moments of Kaylen's life. The community, too, followed the trial closely, many asking how someone entrusted with the care of a child could commit such an atrocity. After days of emotional testimony and exhaustive evidence, the jury reached a verdict. The room was tense as the foreman stood and read the word, guilty. For Kaylen's family, the verdict brought justice, but not peace. Justice could convict the guilty, but it could never bring back their child. The judge imposed a severe sentence, decade behind bars, ensuring the stepmother would never again walk free, never again have the opportunity to harm another child. But even with that assurance, an ache lingered, because for those who loved Kaylen Michelle Young, justice was not enough. What they wanted most, what they prayed for every night, was something the court could never deliver: her return. The trial had ended, but for Kaylen's loved ones, the pain had only just begun. Every empty chair at the dinner table, every unopened toy, every quiet corner of the house reminded them of what was stolen. For years old, an age when life is supposed to be filled with laughter, curiosity, and dreams just beginning to form. Instead, Kaylen's name would forever be linked to tragedy. In the weeks after the verdict, her community gathered in vigils. Candles lit the night as neighbors, teachers, and even strangers came forward to honor her life. Balloons were released into the sky, carried with them prayers, love, and a question no one could answer: why? Child advocacy groups seized on Kaylen's story as a rallying cry. They spoke of the urgent need for stronger protections for children, better monitoring of blended households, quicker responses to signs of abuse, and more education for those who care for vulnerable kids. Her case became more than just another headline. It became a reminder of how fragile life is, and how essential vigilance is when it comes to protecting children. For her family, the grief would never fully heal. Birthdays came and went, holidays passed, and each year the absence grew heavier. Yet in their darkest moments, they found strength in remembering Kaylen's spirit, The brightness of her smile, the innocence in her laugh, the way she could light up a room without even trying. Though her life was short, her legacy lived on in the conversations she sparked and the awareness her story raised. Teachers spoke of her in classrooms. Lawmakers referenced her name in debates about child safety. And parents across the country, hearing her story, hugged their children a little tighter. Kaylen Michelle Young's story is one of horror, but also one of remembrance. It forces us to face a painful truth, that sometimes the greatest danger to a child comes not from the outside world, but from the very people entrusted to love and protect them. Her name will never be forgotten, not because of how she died, but because of how much she was loved and how deeply her absence continues to be felt.